The night everything changed began with 3 words I never expected to hear from my son. "Dad," she lied. He whispered them so quietly that, for a moment, I wasn't even sure I had heard him correctly. I looked at him and waited for him to say something else, but he just stood there, staring at the floor. That was the moment I understood something was wrong. Until that night, I had believed my family was ordinary. Not perfect, but happy enough. My wife, Sarah, and I had been married for years, and together we had built a life around our son, Daniel. We had gone through difficult times before, but I always believed those problems made us stronger. At least, that's what I told myself. Our days followed a familiar routine. I worked, Sarah handled many things at home, and Daniel went to school. We ate together whenever our schedules allowed it. On weekends, we tried to spend time as a family. From the outside, nothing seemed unusual. But looking back now, I realized the distance had started long before I noticed it. Sarah had become quieter. She spent more time on her phone and seemed distracted whenever I asked what she was doing. Sometimes, she would leave the room to answer a call. Other times, I would walk into the room and notice her quickly turning her phone face down. I noticed. I just didn't question it. Whenever that uneasy feeling appeared, I found a reason to dismiss it. Maybe she was tired. Maybe work was stressful. Maybe every marriage went through periods when 2 people simply became less connected. I trusted her, and trust has a strange way of making you ignore things you would normally recognize immediately. There were other small changes too. She started taking more time getting ready before going out. She occasionally mentioned plans I didn't remember hearing about before. Her explanations were never obviously impossible, so I accepted them. I wasn't looking for betrayal. I was looking for reasons to believe everything was fine. Daniel, however, seemed to notice something I didn't. He became quieter whenever his mother received certain messages. Sometimes he would watch her from across the room without saying anything. If I asked him what was wrong, he would simply shrug and tell me he was tired. I assumed it was school. I never imagined he was carrying information that could eventually change our entire family. Then came that night. Sarah had gone into the bedroom after dinner, and Daniel was standing alone in the hallway. He looked nervous.
"Dad."
I turned toward him. "What is it?" He hesitated before walking closer. "Can I tell you something?" "Of course." He looked toward the bedroom, then back at me. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Dad," she lied. I felt my stomach tighten. "Who?" He didn't answer immediately. He just looked at me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Then he said, "Mom." Everything inside me wanted to dismiss it. I wanted to tell myself that Daniel had misunderstood something. I wanted to protect the life I had spent years building. But something in his voice stopped me. For the first time, I wondered whether all those little things I had ignored weren't little at all. Maybe they had been warnings. And maybe my son had just given me the first reason to finally listen. I didn't confront Sarah that night. Instead, I went to bed carrying a question I couldn't silence. What exactly had Daniel seen? The next morning, everything looked normal again. Sarah prepared breakfast. Daniel got ready for school, and I went through my usual routine. But something had changed inside me. I wasn't simply noticing Sarah's behavior anymore. I was paying attention to it. I remembered the phone calls she had taken privately, the messages she never opened around me, the sudden changes in her schedule, even the times she had seemed emotionally distant while insisting that nothing was wrong. For the first time, those moments felt connected. After Daniel left for school, I asked him carefully what he had meant the previous night. I didn't want to pressure him, and I didn't want him caught between his parents. He hesitated. Then he told me he had overheard his mother talking to someone on the phone several times. He didn't know exactly who the person was, but he recognized the same name appearing in messages.
"Mark."
The name meant nothing to me at first. Sarah had never mentioned anyone named Mark as a close friend. I asked Daniel where he had heard the name, but he couldn't remember everything. He only knew that his mother became nervous whenever he came near her while she was talking to that person. That was enough to make me uncomfortable, but it wasn't proof of anything. I reminded myself of that repeatedly. A name wasn't evidence. A private phone call wasn't evidence. A changed routine wasn't evidence. Still, I couldn't ignore the pattern. Later that week, Sarah told me she needed to stay late because of work. She gave me the same casual explanation she had given several times before. I simply nodded.
But this time I noticed something.
She smiled while checking her phone. It wasn't the kind of smile someone gives after reading a normal work message. It was brief, private, and completely different from the expression she had been wearing around me. I didn't say anything. That evening, she came home later than expected. When I asked how work had gone, she gave me a short answer and immediately changed the subject. I knew then that I couldn't keep pretending I wasn't suspicious. A few days later, I noticed an unfamiliar notification on the shared tablet we sometimes used at home. It wasn't a complete message, but one sentence was visible. "I wish things were different between us." My heart sank. I read it again. There was no name attached to the notification, but I knew it wasn't a message meant for me. When Sarah entered the room, I closed the tablet. I didn't accuse her. Instead, I waited. That night, while she was asleep, I sat alone thinking about what I had discovered. I hated myself for doubting her, but I hated the possibility of trusting a lie even more. The following morning, another clue appeared. I found a receipt from a cafe across town. The date matched one of the evenings Sarah had told me she was working late. The receipt wasn't proof of an affair. But the more pieces I found, the harder it became to believe they were all coincidences. Then I discovered something that changed everything. There was another message. This time, I saw enough of the conversation to understand that Mark wasn't simply a casual acquaintance. Their messages contained emotional intimacy, private plans, and words that belonged between two people who had crossed a boundary. I didn't need to read everything. I already understood. My wife had been hiding another relationship from me. For several minutes, I sat completely still. I wasn't angry yet. I was hurt. The person I trusted most had been living a part of her life that she deliberately kept outside our marriage. And suddenly, every unexplained phone call, every late evening, and every distant conversation had a different meaning. But there was still one thing I needed before I confronted her. I needed to hear the truth from Sarah herself. So I decided that when the time came, I wouldn't scream. I wouldn't threaten. I wouldn't give her an easy way to turn the conversation into an argument. I would simply ask her the one question she had been avoiding. And this time, I would wait for an honest answer. I waited until we could talk without anyone else around. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't plan to accuse her of everything I had discovered. I knew that if I started shouting, the truth might disappear behind an argument. So I kept the evidence with me and waited for the right moment. When Sarah finally sat down, she noticed immediately that something was different. "What happened?" she asked. I looked at her for several seconds before answering. "I know about Mark." Her expression changed. It lasted only a moment, but I saw it. Her eyes moved away from mine, and the confidence in her face disappeared. "What are you talking about?" she asked. I didn't respond immediately. I placed the evidence in front of her. The messages, the receipt, the information I had already confirmed. She looked at everything without touching it. Then she said, "It's not what you think." That sentence hurt more than I expected. Not because I believed it, because I had heard it before in stories where people were trying to protect a lie. I asked her one simple question. "Then tell me what it is." She remained silent. I waited. For the first time since I had discovered everything, I wasn't trying to force an answer. I wanted her to choose whether she would finally tell me the truth. After several seconds, she admitted that Mark had become someone she talked to regularly. At first, she said, it had only been conversations. Someone she could talk to when she felt frustrated. Someone who made her feel understood. But eventually, the conversations became more personal. Then they became secret. And finally, she admitted that she had crossed a boundary that should never have been crossed inside our marriage. I felt as though the room had become completely silent. I asked her how long it had been happening. She gave me an answer that made the betrayal feel even heavier. It hadn't been a single mistake. It had continued for months. Months of ordinary dinners. Months of conversations with me. Months of telling me everything was fine while keeping an entire part of her life hidden. asked why she never told me she was unhappy. She looked down. I was afraid. Afraid of what? Of losing everything. That answer stayed with me. She explained that she had convinced herself she could keep her family life separate from what was happening outside it. She knew it was wrong, but every time she considered ending it, she delayed the decision. I listened without interrupting. Then I asked the question that mattered most. Did you ever plan to tell me? She couldn't answer. That silence told me enough. The betrayal wasn't only about another person. It was about every day she had looked at me and allowed me to believe something that wasn't true. Then I remembered Daniel. I told Sarah that he had noticed things long before I did. Her face changed again. What did he tell you? I explained that he had heard enough conversations to know something was wrong. Sarah immediately looked devastated. I stopped her before she could blame herself in front of him. He shouldn't have had to carry this, I said. That was when I realized something important. Daniel hadn't caused the problem. He hadn't betrayed either of us. He had simply noticed that the adults around him were hiding something and didn't know what else to do. Sarah began crying quietly. She said she never wanted him to know. I told her that protecting a child doesn't mean pretending nothing is happening. It means making sure the child understands that the adults are responsible for their own choices. Then came the final revelation. Sarah admitted she had already been thinking about leaving the marriage before I discovered the relationship. She hadn't told me because she was afraid of what would happen afterward. That revelation changed the way I understood everything. The affair wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the result of problems she had refused to discuss honestly. But that didn't make the betrayal acceptable. I looked at her and realized I was no longer trying to prove whether she had lied. I already knew. The question now was what I was going to do with the truth. And for the first time, I understood that forgiving someone and trusting them again were two completely different things. The days after the truth came out were harder than I expected. Knowing what had happened was painful, but knowing that life still had to continue was even harder. There were breakfasts to prepare, responsibilities to handle, and a child who still needed stability. I couldn't simply disappear into my anger. Daniel hadn't created this situation, and he shouldn't have to carry the consequences of decisions made by adults. Sarah and I agreed to give each other space. There was no dramatic revenge. No attempt to embarrass anyone. No effort to make Daniel choose between his parents. For the first time, I understood that some situations become worse when people try to hurt each other just because they have been hurt. I needed time to think clearly. Sarah said she wanted another chance. She told me she was willing to answer my questions and accept whatever boundaries I needed. But I had learned something important. Saying sorry doesn't automatically rebuild trust. Trust is created through consistent actions, honesty, and time. I couldn't wake up one morning and suddenly forget everything that had happened. At the same time, I didn't want anger to control the rest of my life. So I stopped asking myself whether I could return to the marriage exactly as it had been. I realized that was impossible. The old version of our marriage was gone. If there was going to be anything after this, it would have to be built differently. For a while, we lived with that uncertainty. Sarah began taking responsibility for her choices instead of blaming circumstances. She stopped making excuses and acknowledged the damage her decisions had caused. I also looked honestly at myself. There were things I could have communicated better. There were moments when I had become too comfortable and assumed that silence meant everything was fine. But I refused to use those shortcomings as an excuse for betrayal. Two people can have problems in a marriage. The answer is communication. It is honesty. It is difficult conversations. It is not secretly building another relationship while pretending everything is normal. The most important part of the entire experience, however, was Daniel. One evening, I sat with him and told him something I wished he had never needed to hear. None of what happened was his fault. I told him adults sometimes make choices that create problems, but children are not responsible for fixing those problems. He didn't need to protect me. He didn't need to take sides. He only needed to be my son. He looked at me quietly and asked whether everything would eventually be okay. I told him I didn't know exactly what the future would look like. But I promised him one thing. We would face it honestly. Months later, I realized that the 3 words Daniel whispered that night had changed more than my marriage. They changed the way I understood trust. Before that night, I thought protecting a family meant keeping difficult truths hidden. Now I understood that sometimes the truth is what allows a family to heal. I don't know whether every broken marriage can be repaired. Some can, some can't. But I learned that forgiveness should never mean pretending nothing happened. And moving forward doesn't always mean returning to the way things were. Sarah and I eventually made a decision about our future based on what was healthiest for everyone involved. Whatever happened between us, one thing remained clear. Daniel deserved parents who could be honest with him and with themselves. Looking back, I still think about that night. Not because my son exposed a secret, but because he reminded me how much children notice, even when adults think they are hiding everything. Those 3 words didn't destroy my family. The lies had already done that. Those 3 words simply forced the truth into the open. And sometimes, the truth hurts because it ends the life you thought you had. But it can also give you the chance to build a life that no longer depends on pretending. I learned that love without honesty can become fragile. Trust cannot be demanded. And family isn't protected by hiding every painful truth. Sometimes, family is protected by having the courage to face the truth together. That night, my son whispered 3 words. I thought they were the beginning of the end. Instead, they became the beginning of something different. A life where I would never again confuse silence with peace or comfort with truth.